The crew has submitted a formal petition requesting that you be granted full citizenship rights, honorary Mirathi status. The first time such a petition has ever been filed for a non-Mirathi individual. Marcus stared at him. What? Additionally, Dr. Vashani has noted that the cubs display signs of separation distress when removed from your presence for extended periods. And she has recommended that any adoption proceedings take this bond into consideration. Captain, the government officials have agreed. Vershan continued, if you are willing, they would like to offer you the opportunity to formally adopt the cubs as your legal dependents, with full support from Mirathi Social Services to assist with their care and education. The room went very quiet. Marcus looked down at Pip, still purring against his chest, at Bramble and Thorn, who had woken up and were watching him with those intelligent golden eyes. You're offering me a family, he said slowly. We are offering the cubs a guardian who has already proven he would die for them. Vershan corrected. The family part is simply the natural consequence. I'm just an engineer. Marcus said, I don't know anything about raising kids. I don't even know anything about Mirathi culture or customs or, how to love them. Kesvara interrupted. You know how to protect them. You know how to make them feel safe. And everything else can be learned. She met his eyes. Do you want them, Marcus? Not can you handle them, or are you ready for them, or do you deserve them? But do you want them? Marcus looked at the cubs. Pip was watching him with absolute trust. Bramble's tail was wagging slowly. Hopefully Thorn had moved closer, her golden eyes bright with something that looked like longing. Yeah, Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. Yeah, I want them. I want them so much it hurts. Vershan nodded solemnly. Then it is settled. The paperwork will be completed by the time we reach Hollow Point, and you will disembark not as a contract engineer, but as a Mirathi citizen, with 3 dependents. He paused at the door. The crew would also like me to inform you that a collection has been taken up to purchase supplies for the cubs. Since you will apparently need them, Marcus couldn't speak. Kesvara stayed after the captain left. She watched Marcus hold his cubs, all 3 of them now piled in his lap, making small sounds of contentment as he stroked their fur and whispered promises that he would keep them safe forever. I still do not understand it, she said quietly. Which part? Any of it. Why you risk your life for strangers? Why the crew chose to fight when surrender was the logical option? Why any of this happened the way it did? Marcus considered the question. There's a saying on Earth, he said finally. Something my grandmother used to tell me when I asked why we should help people who couldn't help us back. What was the saying? Marcus smiled and held his cubs close. She used to say that love isn't a transaction, that you don't give it to get something back. You give it because giving it is the whole point. Because the universe is cold and dark and scary, and the only way to make it less cold and less dark and less scary is to be warm and bright and brave whenever you get the chance. He looked at Kesvara. Maybe that doesn't make sense to Mirathi. Maybe it doesn't make sense to most species out here, but it makes sense to humans. And now it makes sense to 3 little cubs who know that someone fought for them when no one else would. Kesvara was silent for a long time. Then she reached out and rested her paw on his hand, just as she had in the cargo bay on the day they first met, just as she would 1,000 times in the years to come. Perhaps it makes sense to more than just humans, she said, outside the viewport. The stars wheeled slowly past, ancient and indifferent, caring nothing for the small dramas of mortal creatures. But inside the medical bay of a battered freighter limping toward home, warmth had found a way to survive a human with broken ribs and a full heart held 3 cubs who had once been alone. In the dark, a navigator, who had always followed the rules, sat beside them and learned what it meant to follow her heart instead. And somewhere, in the vast cold mathematics of the universe, An equation balance that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with love. This was the way humans changed things. Not with weapons or technology or superior tactics, but with stubborn, irrational, magnificent compassion, with the simple refusal to abandon the small and scared, with the belief that every life mattered, even the lives that belonged to someone else's species on someone else's world. The Mirathi would remember this. The Scythians would remember. This, and 3 small cubs with golden eyes would grow up knowing that when the universe tried to throw them away, a human had caught them and held them close and never let go. That was the power of humanity. That was their gift to the stars. That was why the cat cubs stopped crying in the cargo bay, because the human shielded them when the alarms began to scream, and he never stopped. The salvage ship Resolute drifted through the asteroid belt of Kepler 442. Its sensors scanning for anything worth collecting from the debris field that spread across thousands of kilometers of empty space. Elena Vasquez stood at her station in the cargo bay, watching the scanner readouts, with tired eyes, as she had done for the past 6 hours, without finding anything valuable enough to justify the fuel they had spent getting here. She was 32 years old, with short black hair and hands covered in old scars from years of cutting apart wrecked ships for parts and salvage. And she had been working on the Resolute for almost 5 years now. The work was boring most days, but it paid well enough to send money back to her younger brother on Earth, who was trying to finish his medical training. "Got something?" called out Captain Morrison from the bridge, his voice crackling through the ship's old communication system that really needed to be replaced but never seemed to make it to the top of the repair list. Elena looked up at the main screen as it flickered to life and showed the broken remains of a ship about 2 kilometers away, spinning slowly in the darkness between the rocks. The ship was clearly Felixari in design, with the curved lines and organic shapes that their species preferred for their vessels. And even from this distance, Elena could see the massive holes torn through its hull by what looked like railgun fire. Pirates. "Got them," said Morrison with a grunt of disgust in his voice as he guided the Resolute closer to the wreck for a better look at what they were dealing with. The Felixari were one of the most feared species in the known galaxy, standing over 7 feet tall, with bodies covered in fur that ranged from deep black to bright orange depending on their family bloodline. They had claws that could cut through metal plating like it was soft cheese, and teeth that could crush bone without any effort at all. And most other species tried very hard to stay out of their way, but even the mighty Felixari could fall victim to pirates if they were caught. Alone and outnumbered in the wrong part of space, Elena suited up and took a shuttle across to the wreck, her plasma cutter strapped to her hip and her scanner in her hand as she floated through the torn opening in the ship's side. The interior of the Felixari vessel was dark and cold, with frost forming on every surface from the heat bleeding out into space through the holes in the hull. Elena moved carefully through the corridors, checking each room for anything valuable that the pirates might have missed in their hurry to grab what they could and escape before anyone came to investigate. She found the bodies of the crew in the main corridor. 4 adult Felixari who had died fighting to protect their ship from the attackers who had boarded them. They were huge even in death, their fur matted with frozen blood, and their claws still extended as if they were ready to keep fighting even after their hearts had stopped beating. Elena felt a wave of sadness wash over her as she looked at them, because no matter what species you were, death was always ugly and always wrong. She was about to move on when she heard something that made her stop and hold her breath to listen more carefully. It was a sound, soft and high-pitched, coming from somewhere deeper in the ship where the hull was still mostly intact. Elena followed the sound through another corridor and into what looked like a private cabin. probably belonging to the captain or another high-ranking member of the crew. And there she found them, 3 Felixary cubs, no bigger than house cats from Earth, huddled together beneath the body of an adult female, who had clearly used her own body to shield them when the hull was breached. The mother was dead, her eyes closed and her arms still wrapped protectively around the space where her children had hidden themselves to survive the attack that had killed everyone else on the ship. But the cubs were alive. They looked up at Elena with huge amber eyes that reflected the light from her helmet lamp, and she could see them trembling with cold and fear as they pressed themselves against each other for warmth. The smallest one was a gray female with a torn ear that was still bleeding slightly, and she let out a tiny mewling sound that broke something inside Elena's chest. "Oh no," Elena whispered to herself as she knelt down slowly so she would not scare them any more than they already were. She knew she should call the captain and report what she had found so he could decide what to do with them. But something stopped her from reaching for her communicator right away. The gray cub with the torn ear slowly crawled out from under her mother's body and approached Elena with shaky steps, sniffing at the air to try and understand what this strange creature was. Elena held very still and let the cub come to her, knowing that any sudden movement might send all 3 of them running to hide somewhere she could never find them. The cub reached Elena's hand and pressed her tiny head against the palm of her glove. And then she did something that Elena had never expected a Felixari to do. She began to purr. It was a weak sound, barely loud enough to hear through Elena's suit, but it was unmistakably a purr of trust and need and desperate hope that this stranger might help them survive. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she looked at the 3 orphaned cubs whose mother had given her life to protect them from danger. "Vasquez, report," came the captain's voice through her communicator, sharp and impatient as always when she took too long to check in. Elena looked at the cubs and made a decision that would change her life forever. "I found survivors, Captain," she said as she carefully gathered all 3 cubs into her arms where they snuggled against her suit for warmth. 3 Felixari cubs, maybe 6 months old, and I am bringing them back to the ship." There was a long pause before Morrison responded, and when he did his voice was cold and hard. "Negative, Vasquez. Leave them there and continue the salvage operation as ordered." Elena looked down at the gray cub, who was still purring against her chest, trusting her completely, even though they had just met moments ago. "I am sorry, Captain," she said as she turned and began walking back toward the shuttle with the cubs held safely in her arms. But that is not going to happen. She could hear Morrison shouting through the communicator, threatening to dock her pay and leave her behind, and a dozen other things that did not matter to her at all, because Elena Vasquez had made her choice, and no one was going to make her abandon these 3 helpless children who had already lost everything else in the universe. She carried them back to the Resolute and refused to let anyone take them from her arms. 3 days passed since Elena brought the cubs aboard the Resolute, and in that time, she had barely slept more than a few hours at a stretch because she was too busy taking care of them. She had converted a corner of the cargo bay into a small den for them, using thermal blankets and spare uniforms to create a warm nest where they could sleep and feel safe. The cubs had started to recover from their terrible experience on the wrecked ship, and Elena had learned to tell them apart by their personalities as much as by their appearance. The largest cub was a male with orange fur and bold stripes who liked to explore every corner of the cargo bay and get into everything he could find. The middle cub was another male with black fur so dark it seemed to absorb light, and he was quieter than his brother, but always watching everything with intelligent golden eyes. And then there was the smallest cub, the gray female with the torn ear, who had first approached Elena on the wrecked ship, and she had become Elena's shadow from the moment they arrived on the Resolute. The gray cub followed Elena everywhere she went, crying pitifully if she was left alone for more than a few minutes at a time. Elena knew that the cub had bonded with her as a replacement for the mother she had lost, and the thought filled her with both joy and fear because she did not know what would happen to them when they reached port. Captain Morrison had made it clear that he was angry about the situation, but he had not tried to force Elena to get rid of the cub since they left the asteroid belt. He did warn her that Felixari politics were complicated and dangerous, and that keeping their young without permission could cause serious problems for the entire crew. Elena did not care about politics or problems or anything else except keeping these 3 small lives safe from harm. On the 3rd day, the sensors detected a ship approaching them at high speed, and Elena felt her stomach drop when she saw the markings on its hull. It was a Felixari warship, one of the massive battlecruisers that their species used to enforce their will across a dozen star systems. The ship was called the Crimson Fang, and even Captain Morrison went pale when he saw it coming toward them. Through the darkness of space, "We are being hailed," said the communications officer in a voice that trembled slightly with fear. The main screen flickered and then showed the face of a Felixari warrior that made Elena's blood run cold. He was enormous, even by the standards of his already massive species, with a mane of black fur that was braided with small bones and other trophies from his many victories in battle. His claws were extended and covered in gold that gleamed in the light of his ship's bridge, and his eyes burned with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "I am Warlord Krathax of the Crimson Fang," he said in a voice like grinding stone that seemed to shake the walls of the resolute even through the communication screen. "You have something that belongs to me, and you will surrender it immediately or face destruction." Captain Morrison tried to speak, but his voice came out as a squeak that was embarrassing for everyone who heard it. Elena pushed past him and stood in front of the screen, looking up at the terrifying face of the warlord without flinching. "What exactly do you think we have that belongs to you?" she asked in a steady voice that surprised even herself. Krathax leaned closer to the screen, and Elena could see every detail of his massive fangs and the scars that covered his face from countless battles. "The cubs," he growled with a hunger in his voice that made Elena's skin crawl. "3 cubs from the transport vessel Whisker's Grace, which was destroyed in my territory 3 days ago. They do not belong to you," Elena said as she felt her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "They are orphans whose mother died protecting them from pirates." The warlord laughed, and it was the most unpleasant sound Elena had ever heard in her entire life. Under Felixari law, orphan cubs of a fallen house become property of whichever warlord claims them first, he said with a grin that showed all of his terrible teeth. "I am claiming them now, so bring them to me or I will come aboard your pathetic ship and take them myself." Elena felt sick as she realized what he was saying. These cubs were not going to be rescued or given to loving families who would raise them with kindness and care. They were going to be taken by this monster and turned into soldiers, their identities erased, and their only purpose in life to fight and die for his expanding territory. She thought of the gray cub with the torn ear who purred every time Elena picked her up, and she knew she could not let that happen. "No," she said simply. Krathax blinked, clearly not used to hearing that word from anyone, especially not from a small human female who barely came up to his chest. "What did you say to me?" he asked in a dangerous whisper. "I said no," Elena repeated as she stood her ground and refused to look away from his burning eyes. "You are not taking those cubs anywhere. And if you try to board this ship, I will stop you myself." The warlord stared at her for a long moment, and then he began to laugh again. "You will stop me," he said, between laughs that shook his massive frame. "You? A tiny human with no claws and no fangs and no natural weapons of any kind. That is correct, Elena said without smiling. Krathax stopped laughing and leaned very close to the screen. I will be aboard your ship in 1 hour, he said in a voice as cold as the space between stars. Have the cubs ready to hand over, or I will kill everyone on that ship and take them anyway. The screen went dark, and Elena turned to find the entire crew of the Resolute staring at her like she had lost her mind. Maybe she had, but she was not going to let anyone take those cubs without a fight. Elena spent the next hour preparing for something she knew she probably could not survive. She sent the rest of the crew to the far side of the ship, where they would be safer if things went badly. Ignoring their protests and their offers to help, this was her fight and her choice. And she was not going to let anyone else get hurt because of her decision to save 3 orphan cubs from a cruel fate. She gathered the cubs in the cargo bay and settled them into their nest of blankets, making sure they were comfortable and calm before the warlord arrived. The gray cub with the torn ear seemed to sense that something was wrong, because she kept pressing herself against Elena's leg and mewling softly as if asking what was happening. It is going to be okay, Elena whispered as she stroked the cub's soft fur and tried to believe her own words. I am not going to let anyone hurt you. I promise. She checked her equipment one final time before the airlock cycled and announced that someone was boarding the ship. Her plasma cutter was strapped to her hip, the same tool she had carried for years to slice through salvage and wreckage during her work. In her other hand, she held a small device that she had rigged together from spare parts during the past hour. It was a dead man switch connected to the cargo bay's emergency venting system, and if she released her grip on it, the entire bay would open to space in less than 3 seconds. Elena stood between the airlock door and the nest, where the cubs were sleeping, planting her feet firmly on the deck and waiting for whatever came through. The door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Warlord Krathax stepped into the cargo bay. He was even more terrifying in person than he had been on the screen, towering over Elena like a mountain of muscle and fur and barely contained violence. His golden claws clicked against the metal floor as he walked toward her, and his eyes swept across the room until they found the cubs sleeping in their nest behind her. Step aside, human, he growled as he came to a stop just a few meters away from where she stood. The cubs are mine by right under Phylaxari law, and your species has no standing in our legal system. Elena did not move from her position. You are right, she said in a voice that was calmer than she felt inside. I have no standing in your law, but I am not moving. Krathax tilted his massive head to one side as if he was trying to understand a puzzle that made no sense to him. You cannot fight me, he said slowly, as if explaining something obvious to a small child. Your bones would snap like dry branches under my claws, and your flesh would tear like wet paper if I decided to strike you. He extended his claws fully, letting the light catch the golden coating that covered them. You have no natural weapons, he continued with a hint of amusement in his rumbling voice. No claws, no fangs, no armor on your skin. Nothing that could possibly threaten me in any way. No. Elena agreed as she raised the plasma cutter in one hand and showed him the dead man's switch in the other. I do not have any of those things. Krathax looked at the devices in her hands with curiosity but no fear. What are those supposed to be? He asked with a slight sneer. This is a plasma cutter, Elena explained as she activated it briefly to show the bright blue flame that could slice through metal. And this is connected to the emergency venting system for this cargo bay. She watched understanding slowly dawn in the warlord's eyes. If I release this switch, the entire bay opens to space, she continued in the same calm voice. Everything in here gets sucked out into the void, including you, including me, and including those cubs you came to take. Krathax was silent for a long moment as he processed what she was telling him. You would kill yourself, he finally said with disbelief clear in his voice. You would kill those cubs you claim to want to protect, just to stop me from taking them. Yes, Elena said without hesitation. That is insane. The warlord growled as his fur began to bristle with agitation. That is the most illogical thing I have ever heard in my entire life. Probably, Elena agreed with a slight nod. Why? Krathax demanded as he took a step forward and then stopped when he saw Elena's grip tighten on the switch. Why would you throw away your life for cubs that are not even your own species? For children that have no connection to you at all? Elena thought about the question for a moment before answering, because that is what humans do. She said quietly, we find things that are small and helpless and need protection, and we protect them even when it makes no sense to do so. She looked the warlord directly in his burning eyes without flinching. You see these cubs as property to be claimed and used for your own purposes. She continued, but I see 3 children who lost their mother and have no one else in the universe to keep them safe. They are Phalanxari. Krathax snarled. They are not your concern. They became my concern the moment that little one pressed her head against my hand and started to purr, Elena said as she gestured toward the gray cub with her plasma cutter. She trusted me to help her when she had no reason to trust anyone, and I will not betray that trust. The warlord's claws flexed as if he was considering whether he could reach her before she released the switch. I could kill you before you could react, he said in a low, dangerous voice, maybe. Elena admitted, you are definitely faster than me and stronger than me and better equipped for fighting than I will ever be. She smiled grimly at him. But I have something your species never really understood about humans, she said. And what is that? Krathax asked with genuine curiosity breaking through his anger. Spite, Elena said simply. Pure, stubborn, irrational spite that makes us do things that make no logical sense, just because someone told us we could not do them. She held up the switch so he could see it clearly. You told me I could not stop you from taking these cubs, she continued. So now I will die before I let you take them. And if I die, they die too, and you get nothing at all. The cargo bay was completely silent, except for the soft purring of the gray cub who had woken up and was watching the confrontation with wide amber eyes. Is that logical? Elena asked rhetorically. No, it is not logical at all. Is it tactically sound? She continued. Absolutely not. It is possibly the worst tactical decision anyone has ever made. She met the warlord's gaze without fear. But I will do it anyway, she finished. Because that is what humans do when something small and helpless is counting on us to protect them. Krathax stared at her for a very long time. And for the first time since he had boarded the ship, Elena saw something other than hunger and cruelty in his eyes. She saw doubt. What Elena did not know during her confrontation with Warlord Krathax was that they were not alone in this part of space. The Resolute had been broadcasting a distress signal since the moment the Crimson Fang appeared on their sensors, and 3 ships had been close enough to intercept the transmission and change course to investigate. The first was a Galactic Union peacekeeping cruiser that was patrolling the border of Phalanxari territory looking for pirate activity in the area. The second was a human colonial frigate that had been escorting a convoy of settlers to a new world in a nearby system, and the third was a ship that no one had expected to see this far from the Phalanxari homeworld. It was the Elder's Grace, a vessel that belonged to the oldest and most respected member of the entire Phalanxari species, Matriarch. Sylvana had lived for over 300 years, longer than any other Phalanxari in recorded history, and she served as the keeper of their species' most ancient laws and traditions. Her fur had long ago turned white with age, and her eyes had grown cloudy from the passage of centuries. But her mind was still as sharp as the claws she no longer extended. She had been traveling to a distant colony to settle a dispute between two lesser houses when her ship detected the distress signal from the human salvage vessel. Normally, she would have ignored such a minor matter and continued on her journey. But something about the situation made her curious enough to investigate when her communications officer intercepted the video feed from the Resolute's cargo bay. She ordered the entire bridge crew to watch it with her. They saw Warlord Krathax, a warrior whose reputation for cruelty was known across the entire Dominion, confronting a single human female who barely reached his chest. They heard him invoke the claim of seizure, the old law that allowed warlords to take orphan cubs as property for their armies, and they watched in stunned silence as the human refused to move, holding nothing but a cutting tool and a switch that would kill everyone in the room if she released it. Fascinating, Matriarch Sylvana said softly as she watched Elena explain why she would not surrender the cubs. Even at the cost of her own life, the warriors on her ship shifted uncomfortably as they listened to the humans speak about spite and stubbornness and the irrational desire to protect something small and helpless. These were not concepts that fit easily into the Felixari understanding of the universe, where strength determined everything and the weak existed only to serve the strong. But the matriarch remembered older ways, traditions that had existed long before. The warlords rose to power and began treating cubs as resources to be harvested rather than children to be cherished. "Set course for the human vessel," she ordered, in a voice that allowed no argument. "We will arrive before this situation resolves itself one way or another." The Elder's Grace was the fastest ship in the region, and it reached the Resolute just as the standoff in the cargo bay had stretched into its second hour of tense silence. Krathax had not moved from his position, and neither had Elena, both of them locked in a battle of wills that could not continue forever. The arrival of the matriarch shuttle changed everything when the airlock opened for the second time and Sylvana walked slowly into the cargo bay, supported by two young attendants. Krathax immediately dropped to one knee in a gesture of respect that the Felixari reserved only for their most honored elders, matriarch. He said in a voice that had lost all of its earlier arrogance, "I did not expect to see you here." Sylvana ignored him completely and walked past his kneeling form to stand in front of Elena, who still had not moved from her protective position in front of the cubs. The old Felixari studied the human for a long moment with her clouded eyes, taking in every detail of her face and her posture and the steady grip she maintained on the dead man's switch. "You are the one who found them," Sylvana said in a voice that was surprisingly gentle for such an ancient being. "The one who carried them from the wreckage of their mother's ship." "Yes," Elena replied without lowering her guard. "And you have been caring for them since then," the matriarch continued, "feeding them and keeping them warm and comforting them when they cry for the mother they will never see again." "Yes," Elena said again. Sylvana nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I watched your confrontation with the warlord through the ship's communication feed," she said. "I heard every word you spoke to him about why you would not surrender these cubs." Elena felt her heart beating faster, but forced herself to remain calm. "Then you know that I meant what I said," she replied. "I will not let him take them, no matter what your laws say about the rights of warlords to claim orphan children." The matriarch's whiskers twitched in what Elena had learned was the Felixari equivalent of a smile. "You did not know our laws when you made your stand," Sylvana said quietly. "You did not know that there might be any way for you to win against a warlord in a matter of claiming cubs." "No," Elena admitted. "I did not know anything about your laws at all. And yet you stood anyway," the matriarch said with something like wonder in her ancient voice. You face certain death without any hope of victory, purely because you had decided that these cubs were worth protecting. She turned to look at Krathax, who was still kneeling on the deck with his head bowed. The human has invoked Cathalar, Sylvana announced in a voice that rang through the cargo bay like a bell. The right of the protector, Krathax's head snapped up, and Elena saw shock and fury, battling for control of his features. That law has not been used in over 200 years, he protested. The law does not expire, simply because it has been forgotten, the matriarch replied coldly. Any being who stands between a cub and death, who offers their own life in exchange for the cub's safety, may claim guardianship under the oldest traditions of our people. She turned back to Elena with respect shining in her clouded eyes. This law is older than the claim of seizure, she explained. Older than the warlords themselves. Older than the current structure of our entire society. What does it mean? Elena asked carefully. It means that you have a legal right to these cubs under Felixary law, Sylvana said simply. A right that supersedes any claim Krathax or any other warlord could make. She looked at the three cubs who had woken up and were watching the proceedings with wide, curious eyes. You offered your life for theirs without knowing the law would protect you, she continued. You stood ready to die for children who are not your species. Not your blood, not your responsibility in any way. The matriarch turned to face Krathax with contempt, written clearly across her ancient features. That is the difference between a true guardian and a scavenger, who feeds on the misfortune of others, she said coldly. Krathax rose to his feet, his fur bristling with barely contained rage. This is not over, he snarled at Elena before turning and stalking out of the cargo bay without another word. The matriarch watched him go and then looked back at Elena with her whiskers twitching. Again, I believe it is very much over, she said quietly. And I believe you have just changed the future of the Felixari Dominion in ways that none of us can yet imagine. 6 months had passed since the confrontation on the Resolute, and Elena Vasquez no longer worked on a salvage ship. She lived on the Felixari homeworld now, in a comfortable dwelling that had been provided by the Elder Council as part of her formal recognition as the guardian of 3 orphaned cubs. The dwelling was built into the side of a mountain overlooking a vast forest, where the cubs could run and play and learn to hunt the way their red ancestors had done for thousands of generations. Elena had been the first human ever granted citizenship in the Felixari Dominion, a decision that had caused considerable controversy among the more traditional members of their society. But matriarch Sylvana had pushed the council to accept her, arguing that Elena had demonstrated the qualities of a true guardian in ways that many Felixari had forgotten how to do. The 3 cubs were growing quickly now, and Elena sometimes had trouble believing they were the same tiny, trembling creatures she had pulled from the wreckage of their mother's ship. Talon was the name she had given to the largest cub, the orange male with bold stripes, who had always been the most adventurous of the 3. He was nearly the size of a large dog now, and he had started learning to hunt small prey in the forest with the help of a Felixari mentor who came to visit twice a week. Shadow was the name she had chosen for the black male with the intelligent golden eyes, and he had developed a talent for problem-solving that impressed everyone who met him. He spent hours studying the electronic devices in their home, trying to figure out how they worked, and Elena had started teaching him basic engineering concepts that he absorbed like a sponge soaking up water. And then there was Myra, the gray female with the torn ear, who had first pressed her tiny head against Elena's hand in the cold darkness of a ruined ship. Myra had grown into a beautiful young Felixari with sleek fur and eyes that sparkled with affection every time she looked at the human woman who had saved her life. She still followed Elena everywhere, still purred when Elena stroked her fur, and still slept curled up at the foot of Elena's bed every night. The cubs had learned to call her Mari, a Felixari word that meant something between mother and chosen family, and the one who found us when we were lost. Elena had cried the first time she heard them use that word, understanding what it meant even before the translator explained it to her. She was their mother now, in every way that mattered. And they were her children regardless of the fact that they belonged to different species. The story of what had happened on the Resolute had spread across the galaxy in the months since that day, carried by travelers and traders and news services that could not resist such a dramatic tale. Elena had become famous in ways she had never wanted or expected, receiving messages of support and admiration from humans and aliens alike, but not everyone was happy about what had happened. Warlord Krethax had challenged the Elder Council's ruling twice in the months following his defeat, demanding that the cubs be turned over to him as his rightful property. Each time he had been rejected, and each time his reputation had suffered a little more among his own people. Finally, the council had grown tired of his complaints and stripped him of his title entirely, declaring him unworthy of leading warriors or claiming cubs of any kind. He had disappeared after that, probably to some distant region of space where he could rebuild his power away from the influence of the elders who had humiliated him. But Krethax was not the only thing that had changed as a result of Elena's stand. The claim of seizure itself had become a topic of fierce debate throughout the Felixari Dominion, with many voices arguing that it was time to abolish the practice entirely. Matriarch Sylvana led the movement to reform the laws governing orphan cubs, pointing to Elena's example as proof that there were better ways to ensure their well-being than treating them as property to be seized by whoever was strongest. 1 year after the confrontation on the Resolute, the Elder Council voted to formally abolish the claim of seizure and replace it with a new system that prioritized the welfare of cubs over the ambitions of warlords. Elena watched the announcement from her home on the mountainside, with all 3 cubs curled around her, and she felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what had happened. A single human, standing alone against impossible odds, had changed the fate of an entire species, and throughout the galaxy, other species began to reconsider their assumptions about the small soft beings who had stumbled into the stars without claws or fangs or any natural weapons to speak of. Humans were weak. Everyone knew that, too fragile and too short-lived to be taken seriously as a threat. But the story of Elena Vasquez and the orphan cubs showed that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous creature in the universe was not the one with the sharpest claws. It was the one who had found something worth dying for years later. When Talon and Shadow and Mira had grown into full adults with families of their own, young Felixari cubs would sometimes ask their elders why humans were treated with such respect throughout the Dominion. The elders would settle onto their haunches and tuck their tails around their paws, their whiskers twitching with the pleasure of sharing a beloved story. "Let me tell you about the Mari and the Warlord," they would begin, and the cubs would lean forward with wide eyes to hear the tale that had changed everything. It was the story of a lone human who stood between 3 helpless cubs and one of the deadliest predators in the galaxy, armed with nothing but a cutting tool and a switch that could kill them all. It was the story of a species that did not need claws or fangs or armored hides to be dangerous, because humans had something far more terrifying than any natural weapon. They had the capacity to love something that was not their own, and the stubborn willingness to die rather than let that love be taken from them. And in a galaxy full of predators and warriors and beings who valued strength above all else, that made humans the most unpredictable and therefore the most respected species of all. Elena lived on the Felixari homeworld for the rest of her long life, surrounded by children and grandchildren who called her Mari and loved her with fierce devotion. And when she finally passed away at the age of 97, the entire Dominion observed a day of mourning for the human woman who had taught them what true strength really meant. Her statue still stands in the capital city. A small human figure with one hand extended and 3 young cubs pressed against her legs. The inscription at its base is written in both Phylexery script and human letters. And it says simply, "She stood when no one asked her to." That was all that needed to be said, because in the end, that was what made humans different from every other species in the galaxy. They stood.